Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about some more reminiscences, and I haven't done this in a couple of years, about Jerry Hines and Franco Corelli, and talk about some of the things I remember. Next year it'll be 15 years that both of those individuals died. Amazing. It's been that long. Well, I met Jerry Hines in the 1990s. I always remember I had been working for Barnes and Noble at the time, and I was doing a lot of their author outreach and getting authors to come in and speak and getting personalities to come and speak, and so I was involved in that. And I had talked to Jerry Hines. Now, I had been introduced to Jerry Hines through a dear old friend of mine named Lee Munsick. Now, Lee Munsick suggested to me, why don't you talk to Jerry Hines? And I said, okay. And I contacted OMTI, which was Opera Music Theater International, which was an organization which he founded. And they gave me his number. I called him, and we were on the phone for 2 hours talking. We hit it off like that. Now, we didn't really talk about anything outside of music, opera, personalities, Edison, early recording, and stuff like that. Now, the day he came to the store in which I worked, I had set up cones for him to come in. And I admit I had never met him before, and he arrived in his car by himself, got out, and he got out, and he got out. There was a lot of him getting out of that car. He was 6'6", monstrous individual. And he came walking in and says, "You must be Jack Stanley." And I said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Come into my office." And so I took him in beforehand. We were going to look at a couple of the books that he had written. One was called The Four Voices of Man, and Great Singing by Great Singers, which is something he had written. So we got into my office, and we started talking, and he stopped me, and he said, "You know I'm a holy roller, don't you?" And I said, "No, I didn't hear about that." So nonetheless, he warned me. And so he came and talked, and he was extremely gracious to me and everything that he did, and we sold a lot of his books. And we became fast friends, and he used to call me and said, "You got to come over for dinner." And he had that bombastic voice. And the way it would work on the telephone was always kind of fun. And maybe he did this with everybody, I don't know. But I would pick up the phone when it was ringing, and I'd hear, "Hello, baby!" That voice, that's the way he spoke. And, I'm reminded of an interesting thing with Jerry Hines. And that is, I asked him to come with me. I was doing recordings of various people and doing interviews of various people. And I was going to do Tony Randall. And Tony Randall, of course, was in the Odd Couple and stuff like that. And so we set everything up to have the interview done and the recording done at his house. And he lived on the west side of Manhattan by the Museum of Natural History. So I picked up Jerry and we drove over there. Had to find a place to park, which was a real pain in the tuchus, but finally I did. We got up there, we had to heat the wax to make cylinder recordings. And sat there and I talked to Tony Randall for a while. Explained to him the whole idea about recording, which he seemed to be very fascinated with. And the whole idea, and I pulled out things and he would look at. And we talked about some early recording artists. He was a massive fan of Tito Ruffo. He loved Joseph Jefferson. In fact, one of his children used Jefferson as a middle name in honor of Joseph Jefferson, the actor. we talked about the Walt Whitman cylinders, and I said, I really think they're fakes. And he said, oh, I wish they weren't. I can remember him saying, let it go, let it go. And so while they were getting all set to make the recordings, in which Tony Randall talked about some of the great drunks he had worked with, George C. Scott, in which he said cocktail hour started at 9 a.m. And also he talked about a play he was in with an individual whose face would turn an ugly purple hue, which I'll talk about another time, but it was interesting how he talked about how the drunks were always the best when it came to acting. And so we made a recording, several recordings actually. We had some foul-ups that didn't work. And then Tony Randall and Jerry started talking back and forth about opera and singing, and how Tony Randall had crawled into Jerome Hines' dressing room after his performance. And just saying how much he had enjoyed it. Obviously he did, since he crawled in. But at one point during this conversation, Tony Randall looked over at Jerry and said, Jerry, what was it like to sing for Toscanini? And Jerry sat there and said, well, he said his eyes were set on infinity, except when you made a mistake, and then they would dart over at you, and they would burn right into you. This is fascinating to listen to. And he said, I was doing a performance with Toscanini as one of the soloists. And he said, I was at the Met, and Johnson, who was the manager at the time, had set me up with certain people to work with, and one was Stravinsky. And he was working on one of Stravinsky's pieces, and he realized he was running late. So he finally got to the rehearsal, and Toscanini was doing the rehearsal, and immediately the eyes went boom, right at Jerry Hines. And Toscanini sat there and said, so what makes you late? And Jerry Hines, he said, I was trying to think of what the heck to say to Toscanini, because he would get excited. He said, Maestro, I was at the Met rehearsing with Stravinsky. And he said, suddenly Toscanini sat there and put his hands up to his head and said, Stravinsky, Stravinsky, oh, that is not music, oh, Stravinsky. And bent over, and for 5 minutes he lamented the fact that Stravinsky was not music. And he said, so I had a lot of these rehearsals at the Met and also with Toscanini. And he said, so all I had to do every time I was late is mention Stravinsky, and he didn't remember a thing else. Just an interesting story. Toscanini was not too fond of Stravinsky. Oh, Stravinsky. I remember Tony Randall fell over into his chair laughing, listening to that. That was a fun time. When Franco Corelli would come, he'd come and visit, and I used to go and pick him up all the time in New York. Now, they lived in Italy a good deal of the time, but when in New York, they lived on 57th Street, and so Jerry would call me up and say, hello, baby, you want to go pick up the Corellis? And I said, sure, I'll take care of it. And so I would sit down and I would get into the car and drive over and pick him up on 57th Street. And we'd always have these wonderful conversations on the way over. Mrs. Corelli always had that dog with bows in it. And she was always working on the bows. And she'd go, Franco, does he know where we're going? Franco? And over and over, non-stop. Franco, Franco, Franco. Very interesting. And of course he said, don't worry, we're with Jack. He is the king of New Jersey. So I am the king of New Jersey, basically because of Franco Corelli. But an interesting thing happened. One time we used to do these various trips. We go to Jerry's or wherever and have dinner, and then we go visit like the local opera company. And it was pretty cool, I must tell you. You're walking into a small little opera company, and on one side of you is Jerome Hines. On the other side of you is Franco Corelli. I mean, it was pretty cool. I was walking in with gods. And so immediately, they would just sit there, first off, their jaws would drop because here came luminaries. And then they would all sit and talk, and they would all come to me and say, how do you know these people? And it was kind of fun. I enjoyed it. But nonetheless, we would sit there and they would do their performance, and Franco would always say, sit next to me, and he'd make comments about the singers and this and that. And Jerry would be up on stage going, work on this, and doing his thing. He was a phenomenal voice coach. He and Franco used to battle constantly about different ways of teaching. And so during this whole time, I said, I guess we should get going. And so we got up, and Franco and his wife got up, and the dog got up. And I went to take them back, and I told Jerry I'll take them home to New York. Well, we got lost. We were driving all over the place. But we had a non-stop giggle fest. It was fun. We just told jokes all the way. It was a really enjoyable time. I always remember that. And we finally found our way back to the Parkway. This is before GPS stuff and things like that. And we finally got on. And I stopped and paid the toll. And I said, we are on the Parkway, right? And he said, yes, we are. And so Franco yelled up in the back. He said, we're with the King of New Jersey. Let us through. And we'd all scream and laugh and whatever. And I drove him back. Now, I sang here and there and did programs and whatever, but I had signed a contract to do a show. And I was going to do some Broadway numbers with this soprano. And so we were set to do that. And one of the days, I made recordings for Franco of Luisa Tetrazzini. He loved her voice. And so I made this whole cassette for him. And he was listening to it. And he said, I'm going to wear out the cassette. And he said she was the best soprano that he ever heard. And he called me one day and says, grazie, thank you for the cassette. And he said, we're going to go to the Met, to the opera. We'd love to have you join us. What date was it? The date I had signed the contract to sing. Boy, you want to talk about being pissed off. And so I had to tell Franco Corelli, no. And he said, why can't you join us? I said, because I have to sing. The interesting thing is we had talked about singing, but I never talked about myself as a singer because I wasn't much of a singer. And so I said, I have to sing that night. I said, any other night would work. And he said, there's no other night we have. And he said, you're a singer? He said, what do you sing? I said, I sing tenor. He said, bravo, bravo, bravo. And I got 3 bravos from Franco Corelli. So I thought it was kind of cool. So I went and sang that night. I was none too happy. And I missed out going to the Met with Franco. It must have been an amazing moment. Can you imagine walking into the Met with one of the greatest tenors? I would have loved to have seen the reaction. It would have been amazing. But I've talked about this stuff and my friendship with Jerry and with Franco. And there's more I want to tell. And hopefully I won't wait 2+ years to do it. But I think I'm running out of space here, so I need to end this now. But I always like to remember the things that were said to me by Jerry and by Franco. Franco always said, you will always be successful if you love what you do. And that's true. And Jerome Hines, he never ever lost a sense of optimism, which was quite fascinating. And I'll kind of dissect him a little bit in the future. Maybe we can talk about him, what made him work. Because I realized he was very religious, and I found ways to work around that, which was kind of fun. Thank you.